activities you should organise in your curriculum, consequent or subsequent upon those goals, is what are your quality settings? How are you going to ensure that the experiences the students get are of a high quality given your goals? Different quality settings should follow from different educational goals. If a goal is merely experience, then the quality settings relate to access, equity, safety, OH&S type stuff. It might also include something that's quite routine in many places, reflection on the experience, how I felt, what was it like, what does it mean to me, and that kind of thing. Not highly structured and not specific reflections on where you're given an object to reflect on, but rather just reflecting on the experience. But if the goal is generic employability, then the best design would focus on generic skills that could be applied across a range of workplace contexts. So that's quite like the generic skills that were with the higher ed sector since the early 90s and a bit before. Rather than specific professional competencies and specific professional practices that go with particular professions and the enactment of those professions in those contexts. If the goal is integration of theory and practice, then the quality settings must include such things as opportunities to integrate theory and practice, to test theory and to justify decisions made in practice on the basis of theory. That, I think, is a really important concept. And if you took away nothing from today's talk, if you took away this idea of integration of theory and practice, and I will say a little bit more about it in a second, that would be probably a worthwhile thing to have got out of it. If the goal is professional practice competency, then the design should articulate the range of and standards for the practices to be learned and should involve integration. In other words, you've seen in some places, particularly the allied health disciplines, they're quite clear, although it's a research endeavour in itself, they're quite clear usually about what the professional practice standards are, and they teach to those standards. And that's highly appropriate. I presume accountancy does it too, not that I look particularly at accountancy. And many other disciplines would be like that also. So in terms of how you'd understand whether you're doing a good job, and I've just couched this very generally as quality settings, you can see that they might vary also according to what you're doing, and what you're doing would vary according to what you're trying to achieve. So if the focus is on employability, or with a focus on employability, we can see, I should say, I drew the two yellow lines there just to separate out levels of generality, partly, where down underneath the bottom yellow line is the more meaty stuff where theory and practice are integrating, or when you've got professional practice standards. The very top one is mere experience and unfocused reflection, and in between there you've got the generic employability agenda. Similarly here, I divide these two up into a generic collection of items and profession-specific ones. Now, what I've got up here are the measures that we used in our study as the measures of employability. So the following slide will be the things that count towards producing employability, but you need to know how we understood employability, how we operationalised and measured it for one of our studies. And so we have this collection of things that you could imagine might have a profession-specific flavour, but can easily be sort of transferred to other contexts. Things like communication, lifelong learning. Stephen referred to personal epistemologies. I cluster a whole range of skills and values under the notion of lifelong learning to do with the valuing of and skills in continuing to learn. Self-efficacy and confidence to apply for work and be effective at commencement. I think Stephen's talk also mentioned that in one of their preferences that students have. One of the things they want as an outcome is confidence in getting a job. And then comes informed decision-making, planning, data analysis and interpretation. Fairly generic things that could apply to multiple settings. And then there's a range of profession-specific things, and that's where integration comes up again, and professional standards. So those are the ways that we operationalise employability. So the question is, what aspects of will curricula contribute to outcomes in these particular dimensions? But before that, I said I'd talk a little bit about integration. I want to do that now. If you can imagine, we have theory, the stuff that our own research informs us within our disciplines is important stuff for students maybe to know. I am not a person who believes that practice determines what a student should know. I think that is wrong and it's faulty. And it's faulty because we do have certain theoretical things that we know with differing degrees of ecological validity, I'll grant you that. But that we really want students to have that in their background knowledge when they go out and practice. You'll be aware of the concept, even in the research on communities of practice, but the idea that you can have a degraded practice in a particular professional setting, and if that gets reproduced by a process of acculturation of new employees, then that's not as good an outcome as having students who know what they ought to be doing because of what theory tells us is correct, and then taking that into the workplace and enacting that. So if you can imagine that, we've got the intersection of professional contexts, generic and professional skills, and theory. I'll just unpack that now. So if you just want to find out where the little, that's the button. Here we have, within a professional context, using generic and professional skills. Here we have theory in the professional context, justifying. So the example here is communication. So justifying particular communication strategies, giving a reason why I'm communicating with this patient or this client or whatever this way. Sorry, I thought I'd avoid this. And then we have down the bottom here, knowing the theory behind the communication practice that we want. And integration, I think, is at the heart of this. This is the ability to bring together the theory and the practice in the setting. The important stuff about that is that you could imagine being able to defend at any moment the enactment of your professional practice by reference to theory and context. So that's what integration means in this sort of way of looking at it. So the 6 aspects of Will curricula that count. The first is authenticity, with which we're quite familiar. The idea is we put people into contexts that are real contexts, and that is part of the package. Of course, you also know that there's no guarantee that the type of authenticity that they get will be the full range of experiences that you really want them to have. They might only have a narrow range of experiences, even though they've been in a place for 6 months or a term or whatever. But authenticity is important. It's also true to say that we've made some assumptions that only out in workplaces, professional practice contexts, can you get the right kind of authenticity, but it's evidently true that sometimes you can achieve high levels of authenticity in simulation, and the obvious example is pilot training. We train our pilots in very expensive but very highly authentic simulators. The next one is developing opportunities, creating opportunities to develop the intended learning outcomes. So if you have as your intended learning outcomes that they do some of this integration type stuff, and that involves justifying decisions, then what I'm suggesting is that we need to build into the curriculum opportunities for students to justify decisions they make in the professional context, right? Simple as that. If you're setting your curriculum at merely having experience, then just sending them out there is achieving that. But all it says is you better have built into your curriculum the provision of the types of experiences that achieve the goals. And there's a notion of alignment there. Alignment being the notion that we get the activity to be logically similar to or a good affordance for the outcome that you want. It's lined up with the outcome. Assessing the outcomes, it's really important for you as a person accrediting that the student has achieved something specific, because you're setting specific learning outcomes. You need to be able to accredit that, so assessing the outcomes that you intend for the students to develop is a crucial part of it. Giving them preparation. I think Steve mentioned preparation as well. Giving them preparation, psychological and pedagogical preparation to go into a workplace. Some workplaces and practice contexts are very damaging or alarming to human beings. And so the appropriate psychological preparation might be important in your context, but pedagogical preparation is crucial because you need them to be able to come to an understanding of what you're going to expect them to do. So preparation turns out to be very important. Supervision during the journey is crucial, not only for you to catch difficult moments, to be able to triage stress and so on, but also to monitor the educational achievement the students are going through, and then finally debrief, making educational and psychological sense of the experience. So these aspects of curriculum turn out to be highly predictive of the outcomes in those dimensions that I projected before under employability. And the most, when people are doing these things to high degrees or to top quality standards, you get the greatest outcomes in students. So then we might ask, what are my equity settings? And here we have really some interesting questions, because the issues that we talk about in terms of the, how did Stephen put it, the availability anyway of placement experiences and so on, the supply and demand kind of metaphor. It starts to raise interesting questions. If you think about, there's been an equity project, by the way, and Kerry Moore, who was on that one, isn't here, she's in the next room, but you can get the equity projects report from the OLT website as well. But there's some really interesting issues around giving students reasonably equal access to opportunities. But it might be an interesting question to ask whether we need to give students all the same access to the same types of opportunities. Because must it be the case that the same outcome applies to every student? Well, it might, depending on your setting. If you've got professional standards that you're trying to teach to, then yes, you'll need to have the same outcomes as students. But what about that case where generic employability is the outcome? And if that makes sense in your discipline, and you plumb for that idea of maybe improving students' employability is a good outcome. So not having lines in the sand like HDs and distinctions and so on, but talking about how much a person individually is improved, then the outcomes for individuals might vary. And that could be an okay arrangement. But continuing on with these equity issues, must they be the same for each student or different for each student? And are all students assumed to have the same level of access? Privilege, distance, discretionary time. So some students have to travel further for a placement. So these are the issues that are routinely dealt with in equity, and that's a group of issues that are brought up in that project. You can read more about that when you get to read that project. My point is that in terms of offering quality curriculum, you'd have to take into account some equity questions. So what? So if we worry about the current moment as one where upscaling is a big impetus, a big force on you, then we can start to ask questions of like, how can we guarantee the quality of will curriculum given upscaling? And I'll leave you to discuss in your own time, and I'll provide these slides, these questions, but it's really a matter of more of an intellectual trigger for exploration. On the authenticity question, does every student need the real thing, or would simulation work for some? Or projects run here at Griffith? That might work for some students and be perfectly adequate, provide perfectly adequate levels of authenticity. And it might be a solution to upscaling in some contexts where the supply of placements is limited or doesn't meet the demand. The development of professional generic skills, what do we say about that? Well, what are the outcomes that students should get? Is it possible to assure every student who needs to get? Is it possible to assure that every student who needs to get something? Oh my God, I wrote that last night. Clearly. Is it necessary to assure that every student gets the same thing? What about assessment? What can be done to ensure that assessment is appropriate and gets done by us? We need to establish some standards in the scope of learning outcomes. That's why it's really important to be clear about what we're doing. Thank you. And in some contexts, it involves the creation of measurement instruments for professional competencies around which there is validity research that gets done. And a good example is OT and physiotherapy type disciplines where that stuff is done well. Can preparation be done virtually or with online resources? Possibly. In some cases, preparation can be done virtually or with online resources. I'll just let you know that other universities are grappling with the upscaling problem as well, and some of their solutions involve things like preparation online. Similar to supervision, does it have to be done by us, and does it have to be done one by one? Can it be distributed? Can you have a team of tutors take a small group of students each? What could be the role of IT? How could, moving to debrief, how can debrief be provided for a large number? What about the role of peer debrief? We've learned that students don't prefer to be taught by peers, but the research clearly shows that peer teaching is really valuable, but we're not talking about teaching, we're just talking about debrief. Some risks involved, but it might be possible to do that in a distributed way. In terms of equity, being clear about what our equity issues are around the concept of the same experience. And what about budget for equity scholarships? And what about budget generally in terms of the development of IT, professional development, people, and so on? These are some questions that I leave you with as you grapple with upscaling, quality. I'm done.